Well, hello and welcome to another video in which we're going to discuss what the green energy movement in the form of wind farms are now demanding of the UK government. But first of all, let's just do a little history recall, because they have been claiming it is cheaper than fossil fuel energy. Just look at these recent claims. Offshore wind power now so cheap it could pay money back to consumers. Oh, so all these high energy bills you've been suffering because of wind power, they're planning to pay you money back. Incredible. What a great promise, what a great future. And if you want to know why is wind energy such low cost, just read here. Improved technologies and taller turbines allow wind deployment in areas with lower wind speeds, such as the southeastern United States. In addition, offshore wind has tremendous energy potential. Wind energy systems have low operating expenses because they have no fuel cost. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Well, I wish all that was true, but it's not. I mean, it's simply untrue. It's so misleading. It takes your breath away. So let's look now at what the wind lobby in the UK is saying to the government now. The industry is claiming that unforeseen rising costs now necessitate and justify three actions. I will first take issue with that word unforeseen. They're talking about unforeseen circumstances, somehow that have just happened to them. And because of this, they're appealing to government for more subsidies. We'll see the details of that in a minute. But just concentrating on this unforeseen element, it isn't unforeseen. I've been warning about it for years, as indeed of many, many others. Just look at some of the facts behind the minerals that go in to these wind turbines. I could go on for hours about this subject, but to make life simple, I'll just look at copper. Now, this graph is interesting. It is to do with the density of ore in the copper mine. Now, what we did in the past is we obviously took the easiest, the highest grade copper to mine. But as time's gone on, as we come to the left in this diagram here with all these mines, you can see we're mining less and less pure copper. And the cost of that just starts to really go astronomical up the chart. So as the demand increases and we're having to mine more and more less efficient copper mines, the costs are rising. Put simply, demand is going to completely outstrip the supply of copper, and additional supply is going to cost a fortune. Now, the industry analysts, the people in this business, must have known this, so it can't have been unforeseen. What it was, they could ride the gravy train as long as they liked, because then they hope in the future, to sort of almost maybe blackmail the government into paying higher and higher subsidies to keep that gravy train going. Now, as an example of operating costs, let's take the example here. This is from a report. Take the example of offshore wind farms Hornsea 2 and Moray East, both completed in 2022. With capital costs, that's an ironic amount of 2.75 billion per gigawatt, or more than 4 times the cost of closed-cycle gas turbine capacity. Now, estimates of maintenance costs are as high as 200 million per gigawatt installed per annum. That adds up to a nominal cost of offshore wind generation of £170 per megawatt hour, or about the same or somewhat higher than gas turbines, even in these times of dire high gas prices. Now, notice there, that report is based on the amount of gigawatt installed, the gigawatts installed, but that's the peak. That's if every wind turbine is operating perfectly, perfect speed. That is the peak. It's not what they supply. So when they look at these costs, they're much, much higher in real life. Now, I've actually written to Hornsea 2 and asked them 2 simple questions. I've asked them, 1, how many gigawatt hours do they produce per year or anticipate to produce? And 2, I've asked them how they calculate the number of homes they supply. I already know the answer to that, but I'm asking for confirmation, if you like. So even those figures, that's basically out of the Telegraph, that last report, the UK Telegraph, even those figures are meaningless. To just quote gigawatt is like saying, what sort of performance you get out of your car. Oh, I get 150 miles an hour. I need to know more than that. I need to know more than the top speed. What's the economy like? How much can you produce? And that is not being answered. In fact, it's very, very hard to find the answer to that from any solar or wind farm. When I've actually face-to-face at public meetings challenged the solar farm people, they didn't even know the difference between gigawatts and gigawatt hours. One's a speed or rate of production, and one is the amount of production, how much you get. And you don't pay at home for kilowatts, you pay for kilowatt hours. 1 kilowatt for 1 hour is a kilowatt hour. 1 megawatt for 1 hour is a megawatt hour, and so on. So that is how you've got to see things. Now, as if that was not bad enough, but Siemens, the manufacturer of those turbines in Hornsey and so on, have now recorded a €1 billion loss. That's 800 and odd million loss on the wind turbine business. They simply didn't estimate correctly the costs of maintenance and production, etc. And they are in serious trouble. The share price of a huge corporation, Siemens, has dropped by 34%. So the offshore wind industry, and for that matter the onshore, are facing huge increases in costs on what is already a false base, what's already a totally distorted world that completely deceives you time and time again with the way they present their information. They tell you they supply 2 million homes here, 1 million home there, etc. It's rubbish, absolute rubbish. So let's now get on to what the wind farm industry, what the lobbyists in the wind farm industry are asking the government to do for the future about that strike price. That price that dictates the price you're going to pay for that power for the next 15 years, because that's how long these contracts on wind tend to last. So what are the 3 actions that these wind lobbyists are demanding? Well, the first demand is a vast increase in the budget for the 5th auction, AR5, of the contracts for difference subsidies, with an increase of 2.5 times the current levels for non-floating offshore wind alone. That's 2.5 times the current strike price. So let me explain this contracts for the difference and how it works. To help you understand or the contracts for the difference, I'm using this diagram. Now, what happens is the government will decide it needs 6 gigawatts of green energy, and so the wind power people will say, well, I've got a farm that can supply 1 gigawatt. Pretty meaningless in some ways because they can't do it constantly, but that's what they say. We can supply 1 gigawatt. And the government will then say, fine, what price? And eventually, when they get the 6 gigawatts, when they get up to the 6 gigawatts, and they look at all the different prices, a price will be agreed called the strike price. Now, that price is level line on this diagram, and when it's below the price, now the reference price is the price the market wants to pay. That's the price that people want to buy in power at. Now, when it's below that, in this area here, there's a subsidy. But when it's above that strike price, the wind farm has to pay back so as to make it down to the strike price. So in effect, the wind farm's being paid the strike price all the time. And not only that, allowing for inflation and all sorts of things, it's guaranteed it for 15 years. So 15 years ahead, the government commit to strike prices. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Well, real life, what happened is wind farms were built, but because of the energy crisis caused in effect by wind farms and solar and the whole green movement, plus the Ukraine war added to it, because of that, prices went up. And the ones that had actually not signed up to this strike price agreement just stayed outside it. They held back because they were getting the highest price for the day of gas. That was the effect. So they weren't paying the strike price, and for a long time now, for a few years, the wind farms that hadn't signed up to the strike price were paid a much, much higher price than the strike price. They were paid the highest price on that day for the last kilowatt, if you like, of energy that had to be bought in. Everyone got the same, no matter which energy source it came from, the highest price for the day. Now, in addition, the government with wind farms guarantee to take any amount of energy they supply. And don't forget it's intermittent. So even overnight, when let's say it's very windy, then the net result is we have to pay for power we can't use. So we either have to export it, and that normally involves paying the people to take it from us, or we have to pay the farm to turn off. So we have to estimate what they would have produced and then pay them for electricity we didn't get. And then, of course, at times when the wind isn't blowing enough, we've had to pay, as in this example, 50 times the going rate to Belgium to buy in the power. So just to recap there, this is the basic situation. When there's too much wind, like overnight or in times of high winds, and we can't use it, we've got to keep the grid in balance. So to do that, we either say to the wind farm, shut down and we'll pay you anyway, or we have to give it away when people don't want it in Europe and pay, in this example, 50 times the price to give it away. Or when the wind is low and we haven't got enough wind, because we've shut down a lot of other things, we have to go to places like Belgium and say, hold on, we'll pay you 50 times the going rate to buy in power. But it's even worse than that, because the very fluctuating nature of the wind, as I've pointed out in other videos, is such that we have to close down efficient closed-circuit gas stations because they can't react fast enough to cope with the fluctuations in wind, and we have to open inefficient open-circuit gas stations that use 50% more gas, actually 50% more CO2 burned, to cope with this. You could not make this story up. This is a complete mess from top to bottom, and that has to be understood. But as an addition, if we triple the amount of wind power we got, as Labour and the Conservatives plan, now going onshore, then all these problems I've outlined, all these become much, much worse. And the amount we're having to pay to give away or pay to buy in will be much worse. It's just not workable. So to return to the current situation, there are those who, on the current agreement with the strike price, are paid to the strike price. That's a highly subsidised price, of course, and guaranteed into the future. But there are those who haven't signed up and are supplying, and they're being paid the highest price for the day in the market for any energy. So whoever the highest bidder is that secures the amount of energy needed for that time, that's what they're paid. So this incredible price hike will be because of unforeseen circumstances that were obvious from the very beginning. This will lock you into high energy prices for decades to come. And we will still have to pay them to switch off when we don't want the wind, when it's windy and there is low demand overnight. And now for a short intermission from our probable future Energy Minister.
Low cost, homegrown, zero carbon power for our country. Today the cost of solar and wind energy is 9 times less than that of gas.
That is simply untrue. And if it was true, you'd be having all the awards now of cheap wind energy. You'd be having fantastically low prices already. It's not true. When the wind doesn't blow, and we had 9 days of it as one example, and that's at the worst, you need 7,200 gigawatt hours for that 9 days to replace the lost wind. The biggest storage facility in the country is 9.1 gigawatt hours, and that's the De Norway pump storage system. Not 7,200, 9.1. And the biggest battery in the world is 1.6 gigawatts. There is no viable storage system available or even on the horizon that can cope with the storage requirements needed. And what you'll hear them say is, oh, will there be research? We can't build an economy on something that doesn't exist. But this man is living in a total total delusional world. And I will just let him finish his speech before we carry on with the video.
This is the defining truth of our age. This is the undeniable truth of our age. It is cheaper to save the planet than it is to destroy it.
So staying with offshore wind, as it states here, the UK is presently the global leader in offshore wind energy. Wow, we're a global leader in something that's proven far too expensive, and it's why Labour and others have now changed policy from offshore to onshore. It's a total disaster. And I'll continue. It has more capacity installed than any other country, with offshore wind powering over 7.5 million homes. That is a total distortion of the truth. I'll now explain. But in the third quarter of July, offshore turbines contributed around 10% of the UK's power. Right, that 7.5 million homes is based on Ofgem average home. But the Ofgem average home uses 80% of its power from gas. So it doesn't supply 7.5 million homes. At the most, and it is at the most, it supplies 1/5 of that. So it supplies 1.5 million homes. That's the total offshore industry. But it doesn't even manage that, because it has to supply the power from the farm via local distribution systems, not the main lines as it were. Distribution losses can be as high as 15 or 17%. So let's knock 15% off. And when the wind stops blowing, it supplies none. This total exaggeration of the number of houses claimed applies to every single wind farm and solar farm in the UK, because they all use, at the bottom you'll see it, star, according to Ofgem figures, but that relies on 80% of the power being supplied by gas that they're trying to do away with. Yet, this does not stop every single newspaper, radio or TV station for that matter, every single council meeting claiming how many homes are provided by this solar farm or that wind farm, and every one of those is cheating. Just as I've explained, they just rely on according to Ofgem, and no one bothers to look up what that means. And now that Ofgem have embraced net zero, they are not looking out for your interest, they're looking out in the interests of the net zero insanity. The second demand is special new targets and thus market shares for floating offshore wind, one of the most expensive of all forms of generation, and, importantly, the most expensive of all. You see, floating offshore wind is just so expensive that the only way it can be utilised is you guarantee I'm going to take so much of it, regardless of the cost. It is totally absurd. It's dead in the water, to coin an expression. And the third one, a revision of the auction rules so that the winners are not determined by the lowest bids, but by an administrative decision that weights bids according to their value in contributing towards the net zero targets. Wow! Here we are, an auction where the lowest bid doesn't work, where you have to pay, so you're paying extra because, well, they are green. So what does all this boil down to? Well, what it boils down to is that offshore wind is dead. We can mess about with the edges, there'll be all sorts of things. It's dead. It's far too expensive, and you have been lied to all the way through. We are the leaders in the world in a new technology that is not viable. That's what it boils down to. I haven't even got onto onshore. The rigging of auctions so the lowest bid doesn't win, that some judgment is made by an administrator of what price you're going to be locked into for the next 15 years. That's how it works, is it? And by the way, why all this? Because it was meant to be cheap. It was meant to be the cheapest form of generation. And it isn't, is it? And gradually, it'll just crumble. Now, I have shown this graph in quite a few videos. It's the graph of the growth of CO2 in the world, which we all accept, and comes right up to the Cairo conference. When you put all the conferences on it, it shows that conferences make no difference at all. All that we are doing makes no difference at all to the growth of CO2. But a point to note here is this. Look at this line here. If you take it from about 1990, the rate of growth was as per this line. But as you proceed into the future from there, it's actually accelerating. In other words, the concave nature of this curve shows that there is an acceleration in the speed at which we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So to say all these trillions worth of pounds being spent throughout the world are having any effect is absurd. Well, just look at this diagram of world power consumption and how the fossil fuel part is growing very fast. China is now building 6 times more coal plants than the rest of the world combined. What can you do? I mean, I know lots of people can't watch my videos because they're not interested in the subject. I understand that. People maybe want to pass my videos on to relatives or friends, but frankly, they feel it's a waste of time because they won't watch them. Yeah, I understand that. Most people have got their lives to fill, their own things to do, as it were. I'm not blaming anyone for that. What can you do, though? Well, the only thing you can do is not vote for any party that supports net zero. Well, that means you can't vote for any of the mainstream parties. I don't belong to a party. I'm not going to push one or the other. But the requirement should be not to vote for any party that supports net zero. And this big swing over to Labour that we've got now would make matters even worse, and the Conservatives are truly bad, but would make matters much worse than the Conservatives. They're complete ideologues. They're complete nutters, to put it bluntly. And that's how I feel about it. That's the only solution you have out there. Change our government. Stop these idiots running our country and making decisions for you that they don't even begin to understand them. Well, that's the end of another video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've had to go into some little details to give you more background. I mean, this is not a new story. Maya Tusi has featured it and other people in the last few days. What I've tried to do is give you a little bit more background to it so you understand what's going on. Thank you for watching again. See you next time.